Janice's voice drifted softly from behind. "You work way too much," as she massaged George's shoulders. He was seated at the dining table, his gaze locked on the spreadsheet filling his laptop screen, muscles tight, his mind swirling with numbers, deadlines, and the immense weight of endless tasks. George chuckled faintly and leaned back in his chair, glancing up at her with a weary smile. "What you got to keep the bills paid, babe?" "Just a few more minutes, and I'm all yours," he said. "You always say that," Janice replied playfully, but this time there was something different in her tone. She slid her hand down his arm, then abruptly let go, walking toward the kitchen. "Just making sure we stay on track," George muttered, stretching his back and cracking his knuckles. He checked the clock on his laptop. -6 p.m. Dinner was approaching. Janice paused at the fridge, pulling out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Don't forget, Mom's coming for dinner tonight," she said casually, her back turned as she expertly uncorked the bottle. George raised an eyebrow at the mention of her mother, Deborah. It wasn't her sharp tongue or judgmental stares that bothered him. He could handle those. What unsettled him was the way she always seemed to plant doubts in Janice's mind, whispering subtle poison into her ears about their marriage. George had learned to endure those tense dinners, keeping his head down and his responses polite, but they always left him exhausted. "Your mom's coming?" he asked, his voice calm, though inside he felt that familiar flicker of discomfort. "Yeah," Janice replied, pouring the wine into 2 glasses. She turned around with a sly smile. "And one of my friends might stop by too." George's brow furrowed, but he kept his tone light. "Your friends? With your mom?" "For dinner," he chuckled nervously, trying to ignore the creeping unease. "You sure that's a good idea?" Janice handed him a glass and leaned against the counter. "Trust me," she said, taking a sip. "You'll like my friend." Her smile lingered a bit too long, and George noticed a glint in her eyes he couldn't quite decipher. She had been acting odd lately, distant one moment, overly affectionate the next. He chalked it up to stress. Work had been rough for both of them, and George had been putting in extra hours to keep things running smoothly, but it was starting to take its toll. "I'm sure I will," George said, though he couldn't shake the growing unease. He took a sip of his wine and turned back to his laptop, but his focus was gone. He kept glancing at Janice, who had settled on the couch, her fingers tapping away on her phone. Every time it buzzed, she smiled, a secretive smile that set George on edge. "Who are you texting?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Just some friends," Janice answered without looking up. "Nothing important." George frowned but said nothing. He didn't want to seem like the paranoid husband. Janice had always been independent, and he respected that. But tonight, something felt off. The atmosphere in the house had shifted subtly, an almost imperceptible change that made George uneasy. As time passed, he finished his work and shut the laptop with a sense of relief. He stood up, stretched his stiff muscles, and glanced at Janice, still engrossed in her phone, before heading to the kitchen to check on dinner. "What time is your mom coming?" George asked, opening the oven to check the roast. "In about an hour, I think," Janice replied, her voice distant as she typed on her phone. "And your friend?" "Who is it?" George pressed, wiping his hands on a towel. Janice looked up with that same sly smile. "Just someone I think you'll find interesting," she said, without offering any further details. Before George could ask more, the doorbell rang. "That can't be them already," he said, glancing at the clock. It was only 6:30. Janice jumped up quickly, her phone slipping into a back pocket. "I'll get it. It's probably Mom." As the evening wore on, George busied himself in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on dinner. He always took pride in these family meals, no matter how tired he was or how strained things had become between him and Janice. It was his way of showing he still cared, still fought for their marriage. The roast was perfectly seasoned, the vegetables steamed to perfection, and he was placing the wine on the table when the doorbell rang again. "I'll get it," Janice called out sharply from the kitchen. Her tone was casual, even cheerful, but something in it made George's unease deepen. She had been acting strange all night, and her friend Alfred, his presence, still nagged at George. As Janice moved toward the door, George wiped his hands on a dish towel, staring at the beautifully set table. He tried to shake the gnawing feeling in his gut, but the laughter drifting from the hallway only worsened his anxiety. Unfamiliar, masculine laughter. And it wasn't Alfred. George's pulse quickened as he walked toward the dining room to see what was happening. "George, come meet my friend," Janice's voice called out, the same edge in her tone as earlier. When George stepped into the dining room, he froze. Seated at the head of the table was Deborah, her expression smug. But beside her, lounging in a chair as if he owned the place, was a man George had never seen. Tall, muscular, and exuding arrogance, the man wore a tight black shirt and expensive jeans. His hair slicked back in that effortlessly cool way that immediately made George feel inadequate. The man's arm was draped lazily around Janice's waist, her hand resting on his shoulder as if they were a couple. "George, this is Alfred," Janice said cheerfully, gesturing to the man with a grin. "He'll be joining us for dinner." Alfred flashed a smug grin, and extended his hand. "Heard a lot about you," he said. George stood still, frozen for a second, his mind racing. Who was this guy? And why did Janice think it was okay to invite him over without telling him? Forcing a polite smile, George shook Alfred's hand. "Nice to meet you, Alfred," he replied, keeping his tone controlled, though the unease inside him was growing. "Janice has told me all about how hard you work," Alfred commented, his grip uncomfortably tight. "I respect a man who puts in the effort." His smile was patronizing, a subtle mockery beneath the surface. "Yeah, well, someone has to keep the lights on," George replied, pulling his hand away and shoving it into his pocket. He cast a quick glance at Janice, noticing she stood far too close to Alfred. The way she laughed at whatever joke he had whispered, the way she looked at him, it all felt wrong. George cleared his throat. "So how do you two know each other?" He tried to keep his voice steady, though the tension in the air was thickening. Janice glanced at him, almost daring him to dig deeper. "Oh, Alfred and I go way back," she said with a casual wave, sitting on the couch. "We ran into each other recently, and I thought it'd be fun to invite him over." George stood there, struggling to make sense of it all. She had never mentioned Alfred before, and the way they interacted wasn't just friendly, it was intimate. Alfred smirked and sat beside Janice, positioning himself a little too close for George's comfort. He leaned back, his arm resting along the back of the couch, nearly touching her shoulders. "Yeah, Janice and I have been reminiscing. She's told me all about the good times you two have had," he said with a wink, and Janice giggled. George's stomach churned. What was happening? It felt like he was a stranger in his own home, watching his wife flirt with a man who clearly had no respect for boundaries. Before he could say anything, Deborah, sitting at the table, let out a cold laugh. "Janice, darling, isn't it time you told him the truth?" she said, her voice laced with cruel amusement. George's gut twisted. He turned to Janice, trying to ignore the tightening knot in his chest. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. Janice exchanged a glance with her mother, a wicked smile spreading across her face. "Mom's right, George," she said, her voice low but cutting. She placed a hand on Alfred's chest and looked at George with a mix of pity and disdain. "It's time you knew the truth. You're a loser." George's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He took a step toward her, searching her eyes, hoping this was some cruel joke. "What are you talking about?" Janice's smile grew wider, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Come on, George! Don't act surprised!" "Did you really think I've been happy all these years?" She stepped away from Alfred, crossing her arms and glaring at George with cold contempt. "You work yourself to death, thinking you're doing me a favor. But I don't need you. I never have. You've just been convenient." She laughed bitterly, glancing at her mother for approval. "I've been with Alfred for months now. He's everything you're not: strong, dominant, a real man." George felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "Months," he whispered, his mind reeling, struggling to grasp what Janice was saying. His world was unraveling before him. "Janice, you don't mean this?" His voice was barely audible, his hands trembling, though he couldn't tell if it was from anger or heartbreak. "Oh, I mean every word," she said, her voice dripping with venom. Turning to Alfred, she smirked. "Mom's been telling me for ages to leave you, but I figured, why not enjoy both worlds? Alfred gives me everything you can't, especially in bed." She giggled, and Alfred grinned. George felt a chill as her words sank in. He looked between Janice and Alfred, his mind racing, torn between disbelief and rage. "Go on, tell him," baby Janice teased, nudging Alfred playfully. Alfred chuckled, locking eyes with George in a way that felt like a challenge. "Yeah, George," he said, smugly. "Hate to break it to you, but I've been satisfying your wife in ways you never could." George's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms as Alfred's grin widened. "In fact, every time you were out working late, I was here, taking care of things." Alfred winked, lounging back in his chair as if he had won some twisted game. George's vision blurred with fury. He wanted to punch Alfred, to knock that smirk off his face, to scream at Janice for betraying him so cruelly. But instead he stood there, his fists shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. Every part of him screamed to react, but he held back. Violence wasn't the solution, not here, not now. Deborah's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "You've always been such a fool, George," she said, sipping her wine with a smug satisfaction. "I warned Janice not to settle for someone like you. You were always too weak, too narrow-minded." She glanced approvingly at Alfred. "Now, this is the kind of man Janice deserves." George's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. He turned to Janice, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and anger. "You really believe this?" Janice met his gaze without a flicker of emotion. "I do," she said coldly. "You mean nothing to me now, George. You were just a stepping stone." "Alfred is my future," Alfred snorted, taking a sip of his wine. "Yeah, George," he added condescendingly. "Get used to it. I'm the one calling the shots now." He leaned forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You should have seen the signs, buddy. Your wife's been begging for a real man, and now she's got one." George stood there, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him. But instead of breaking, something shifted inside him, a calm, dangerous clarity. He glanced between Alfred and Janice, his face betraying no emotion, though the silence that had followed the earlier chaos was suffocating. The tension in the room was palpable. Alfred slouched in his chair, wiping tomato soup from his burned face, gasping for breath. Janice, still furious but visibly shaken, stood behind him, her hands trembling as she grabbed for a towel. Then there was Deborah, seated calmly, wine glass in hand, watching the scene unfold with a blend of amusement and disdain. George stopped at the head of the table, his eyes slowly scanning the room. For a moment he remained motionless, his expression unreadable. "Well, dumbass," he muttered, his voice dripping with venom, "welcome to the family. Enjoy your last dinner together." Before Alfred could react, George moved with astonishing speed. He grabbed the back of Alfred's neck, his fingers digging into the man's skin, and forced his face back into the steaming bowl of soup on the table. Tomato soup splashed in all directions as Alfred's muffled screams filled the room. His arms flailed helplessly, trying to push George away, but George's grip was firm. Alfred's shrieks echoed as the hot liquid scalded his face. Janice gasped in shock while Deborah's wine glass clattered to the floor as she jumped back in surprise. "George, what the hell?" Janice screamed, her voice a sharp blend of fear and outrage. She moved to intervene, but George was quicker. He released Alfred, who fell back, coughing and choking, his face red and blistered. Without hesitating, George turned to Janice, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can laugh at me? Call me a loser in my own home," he growled. He grabbed Janice's wrist as she attempted to retreat, but there was no escape. In one swift motion, he twisted her arm and shoved her face into the same bowl of soup. Her screams were muffled by the thick liquid as she thrashed, trying to grab hold of anything within reach, but George overpowered her. "You son of a," Janice shrieked as George finally let her go. Her face was dripping with soup, her eyes wide with shock and fury. Deborah, watching her daughter's humiliation unfold, wore an expression twisted with anger, though she seemed more outraged than frightened. "You've lost your mind," Deborah screeched, stepping toward George. "How dare you? You've always been pathetic." Breathing heavily, George turned toward Deborah, a dangerous smile spreading across his lips. The anger he had kept bottled up for so long was beginning to seep out bit by bit. "Me?" George asked, his voice deceptively calm. "You think I've lost my mind? You've been poisoning her against me from the start." He stepped closer to her, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Deborah's face. Whispering in her ear, telling her to leave me, waiting for me to fail. His voice grew louder, and Janice flinched behind him. "Well, guess what? I'm done with all of you." Deborah opened her mouth to respond, but George cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Enough," he snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You think you can humiliate me, use me, and just walk away unscathed? Think again." Janice, now wiping soup from her face, tried to compose herself, her defiance momentarily shaken, but her voice still full of bitterness. "You're insane, George. You think this changes anything? You think hurting us makes you some kind of hero? Look at you, you're a joke." George didn't answer right away, his eyes cold and calculating as he stared at her. For the first time that night, Janice seemed to realize just how deep his fury ran. Alfred, half collapsed in his chair, whimpered as he gingerly touched his blistered face, but neither George nor Janice paid him any attention. "You still don't get it, do you?" George said softly, his voice disturbingly calm. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I don't care what you think of me anymore. You made your choice." He gestured toward Alfred, who groaned pitifully in his seat. Alfred was in no state to defend himself, both his pride and his face battered. Janice's gaze flickered between them, but her anger wouldn't let her back down. "You were never enough, George," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "You'll never be enough, not for me, not for anyone. I was going to leave you anyway. Alfred is a real man, not some overworked loser like you." Deborah nodded in agreement, her lips curling into a sneer. "She's right, George. You've always been beneath her. You could never provide for her the way a real man could. You could never give her what she truly deserves." George's expression darkened as he shifted his attention fully to Deborah. A cold, dangerous smile tugged at his lips as he took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "You," he said softly, his voice steady but menacing. "You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? Filling her head with lies, telling her she could do better, that I'm nothing but a loser." He stopped just inches from her, locking his eyes onto hers. "Well, Deborah, here's some news for you. The only losers here are you and your daughter." Deborah recoiled slightly, her confidence faltering. "Don't you dare speak to me like that," she hissed. "You're nothing." George cut her off with a loud slam of his hand on the table, the sound reverberating through the room and silencing everyone. "You've taken enough from me," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Now I'm taking something back." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small envelope, and tossed it onto the table in front of Janice. Janice stared at the envelope, her expression confused. "What's this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Divorce papers," George responded flatly. "I've already signed them." "You've lost everything, Janice. If you want to be with him, fine. But you won't get a single cent from me, not after what you've done." Her face went pale as she tore open the envelope, her hands trembling while she scanned the papers inside. "You can't do this," she screamed, her tone desperate. "You can't just leave me with nothing." George gave her a cold smile. "Watch me." Alfred groaned weakly from his seat. "You can't just." "Shut up," Alfred, George cut in sharply, not even bothering to look his way. "You're both done. You made your choices, now live with them." Deborah stood silently, shocked, while George turned his back on them and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Janice demanded, her voice laced with panic. George paused with his hand on the door handle. "Away from all of you," he said simply. "You've taken enough of my life. Now I'm taking it back," and with that, he walked out, leaving behind the ruins of what used to be his family. George's life changed in the days that followed, but not in the chaotic way one might expect. For him, it was about control. After years of being suffocated by a marriage riddled with lies and manipulation, he finally felt in charge. His actions were no longer driven by rage, they were calculated, deliberate. His revenge wasn't going to be a single outburst, it would be slow, methodical, and devastating. It started with the legal process. "I want the divorce finalized as fast as possible," George told his lawyer over the phone. "I'm not interested in dragging this out. Just get it done, and leave her with nothing." "We'll move swiftly," the lawyer assured him. "Given what you've provided, and the evidence you've gathered, this should be a straightforward case." George had kept everything, every text, every financial document. He had proof of Janice's affair and her attempts to drain their joint accounts, all neatly compiled. His legal team worked quickly, and within days Janice was served with the divorce papers. At the same time, George made sure the news of Janice's betrayal spread throughout their social circle. It didn't take much effort, he posted nothing himself, but word of the disastrous dinner party traveled fast. Soon friends, family, and even colleagues were whispering about Janice's affair with Alfred, the man known for his oversized ego and little else. In the days following the dinner, Janice's phone buzzed constantly, but the messages weren't what she was used to. Friends who had once filled her house for parties now distanced themselves, disgusted by her actions. Some were appalled by her cruelty, others by how she had openly boasted about using George for his money. Her social circle quickly shrank. "I thought you were better than this," Janice, one of her closest friends, texted. "I can't believe you did this to George of all people," wrote another. "We need some space." Janice tried to defend herself, but her efforts to win back sympathy failed. The image she had spent years building of the perfect wife, the queen of her social scene, crumbled faster than she could repair it. "How could they turn on me like this?" Janice raged one evening as she paced the now empty house. She had long since stopped expecting Alfred to show up. After the dinner, he had gone silent, ignoring her calls and messages, vanishing without a trace. "You can't just leave me." "Answer your damn phone," she screamed, tossing her phone onto the couch after yet another call went unanswered. Alfred was gone, and she was alone in the house that had once felt like her kingdom. But it wasn't her house anymore, not for much longer. George had anticipated her every move. The moment the divorce papers were filed, he cut off her access to their joint accounts, stopped paying her credit cards, left the bills in her name, and withdrew all financial support. Within days, the harsh reality of her situation hit Janice like a freight train. "George can't do this," Janice muttered to herself as she looked over her now empty bank accounts. There has to be a way out of this, but there wasn't. George had ensured every cent was legally protected, leaving her scrambling. Deborah wasn't faring any better. For years, George had quietly funded her lavish lifestyle, paying her rent, covering her expenses, tolerating her presence for Janice's sake. But now, that obligation was gone. George severed every financial tie to Deborah, watching as she sank into the mess she had created. One day, Deborah called George, her tone sweet as she tried to reason with him. "George, darling, this has all been a misunderstanding," she cooed. "You know Janice wasn't serious. Let's work this out like adults." Sitting in his new, smaller but comfortable apartment, George stifled a laugh. He let her talk for a few moments before cutting in. "Deborah, we're done," he said bluntly. "You've been nothing but toxic for years. I'm not giving you another penny. Find someone else to leech off." Her tone changed instantly, filled with venom. "You'll regret this, George. You can't survive without Janice. You think you're better off without us. You're nothing without her." "I'm already doing better," George replied calmly, ending the call without another word. It wasn't just Janice and Deborah who faced the fallout. Alfred, humiliated after the dinner, quickly became the subject of ridicule. George didn't have to lift a finger for this part of his plan. Word of the dinner party spread fast, and Alfred's reputation as the arrogant lover who had his face shoved into soup became a local legend. He avoided all the places he and Janice used to frequent, eventually disappearing from the scene entirely. Word spread that he had left town, unable to bear the constant ridicule and humiliation that followed him everywhere. With Alfred gone, Janice's situation worsened. Bills began to mount, and soon she couldn't keep up with the house payments. Her credit cards were maxed out, and with no funds left to cover the mortgage, she was forced to sell their home. But without George's income supporting her, the money from the sale barely cleared her debts. In just a few short weeks, the life she had carefully built fell apart, piece by piece. George observed everything from a distance, never once extending her a hand. He saw the emails she sent, listened to the tearful voicemails pleading for help, but they held no meaning for him anymore. Janice had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. In a desperate bid to salvage some piece of her former life, Janice reached out to the few friends she had left. She threw herself on their mercy, hoping someone would take her in or help her start over. But most had already distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone who had treated her husband so heartlessly. "I'm sorry," Janice, one friend said over the phone, her tone polite but firm. "I just can't help right now. I hope you figure things out." "Please, I have nowhere else to go," Janice sobbed, but the call had already ended. One by one, her lifelines vanished. Meanwhile, George was thriving. He had moved into a modest but comfortable apartment in the city, surrounded by real friends, people who had always cared for him, not for the superficial luxuries of his former life. The peace he had craved, the calm he hadn't realized he needed, was finally his. He spent more time at the gym, picked up new hobbies, and even began dating again. His new life wasn't extravagant, but it was genuine. For the first time in years, George felt free from the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal that had weighed him down for so long. One day, as he sat on his balcony sipping coffee and watching the sunset, an email from Janice appeared in his inbox. It was long, filled with apologies, excuses, and pleas for another chance. "I made a mistake, George. I didn't know what I had until it was gone. Please, can we just talk?" George stared at the screen for a moment, the old anger threatening to rise again, but then he smiled. He had already moved on. He closed the email without replying, stood up, and walked back into his new life, leaving the remnants of the old one behind. Janice, Alfred, and Deborah were left to deal with the mess they had created, each scrambling to find a way out. But as for George, he was done. He had reclaimed his life, and there was no going back. Months had passed since the fallout, and George's life had settled into a fulfilling new routine. Gone were the sleepless nights of doubt and anger, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He now lived in a modest, well-maintained house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing like the sprawling home he once shared with Janice, but it suited him perfectly. For the first time in a long while, he felt content. Pouring himself a glass of wine, he swirled the deep red liquid as the light of the setting sun filtered through the windows. Taking a sip, he leaned back in his chair, reflecting on how far he had come. The chaos of his old life was behind him, and the satisfaction of having risen from the ashes of his marriage was almost intoxicating. "Cheers," George murmured to the empty room, raising his glass to new beginnings. As he sat there, his phone buzzed on the table beside him. Glancing at the screen, he expected the usual messages from friends or work, but his eyes froze when he saw the name, Janice. Seeing her name again stirred memories of betrayal and heartbreak, but there was no anger, no bitterness. Those feelings had long since burned away. He had moved on. Still, curiosity got the better of him, and he tapped the message open. "George, I know I don't deserve this, but I need to talk to you. Please." It was a short message, almost desperate, as if she had typed it quickly and sent it before having second thoughts. George stared at the text for a moment, then set his phone down without replying. Taking another sip of wine, he smiled to himself. Janice was no longer his concern. In the months since their divorce, Janice's life had completely unraveled. George had heard bits and pieces from mutual friends and didn't need much to fill in the rest. After Alfred disappeared, she had struggled to keep up with the mortgage, and eventually the house went into foreclosure. Janice was forced to move into a small apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the lavish lifestyle she once flaunted so proudly. As for her mother, Deborah, she quickly burned through whatever savings she had left after George cut her off. The woman who had once sneered at George from her comfortable perch was now living paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping by. It was poetic justice, George thought, considering how she had pushed Janice to betray him. He didn't take pleasure in their downfall, but neither did he pity them. They had dug their own graves, and George had simply chosen not to rescue them. He thought back to that infamous dinner, the moment he had dunked Alfred's face into the bowl of hot soup, and chuckled to himself. That event had been the spark that ignited it all, and it still brought him some satisfaction to remember. The chaos that followed had been inevitable, but it had also been necessary. For too long, George had been a passive bystander in his own life. Now, he was finally in control. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. "Another message from Janice, George, I'm begging you. Just give me 5 minutes. I've lost everything." Please, her desperation was obvious in every word, but George felt nothing. He had given her years of his life, his time, his hard work, his loyalty, and she had thrown it all away for a fleeting affair with a man who vanished the moment things got tough. Whatever Janice hoped to achieve by reaching out now, it was too late. The bridge between them had long been destroyed. Setting his phone to silent, George stood and walked to the large window in the living room, still holding his glass of wine. The sun was almost gone, casting a golden glow over the sky. George watched as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The stillness was calming, a peace he hadn't felt in years. But then a knock broke the silence. George glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for any unplanned visitors. With a slight frown, he went to the door and peered through the peephole. To his surprise, Francisco, an old friend he hadn't seen in months, stood on the doorstep. Quickly unlocking the door, George opened it. "Francisco." "It's been a while," he greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. Francisco nodded, looking a little worn but clearly happy to see George. "Yeah, it has. Sorry for just showing up like this, but I needed to talk to you." "No problem. Come on in. Want something to drink?" George asked as he headed toward the kitchen. "Sure, whatever you're having," Francisco replied, following him inside and glancing around the apartment. "Nice place. Looks like you're doing well." "Thanks," George said, pouring a glass of wine for Francisco and handing it to him. "It's been a long road, but I'm in a good place now." Francisco took a sip, nodding. "I've heard some things about Janice." George raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what now?" Francisco hesitated briefly before continuing. "She's been telling people she wants to reconcile with you. Apparently she's been talking to some of our mutual friends, saying she realizes what she lost and wants to fix things." George's laughter came out suddenly, catching Francisco off guard. "You're serious?" George asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "She had years to make things right and she wasted it all on someone like Alfred. I'm done with her, Francisco. She can say whatever she wants, but that chapter of my life is closed." Francisco leaned back in his chair, nodding. "I figured as much. I just thought you should know." "I appreciate it," George replied, taking another sip of his wine, "but there's nothing she can say or do that'll change anything. I've moved on. She needs to accept that." For a few moments they sat quietly, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Finally, Francisco broke the silence. "You seem different," he said, studying George. "In a good way. Like you've really turned a corner." George smiled, nodding in agreement. "I have. It wasn't easy, but walking away from all that toxicity was the best decision I've ever made. I've rebuilt my life, and I'm better off without all the drama." "Good for you, man," Francisco said, raising his glass in a toast. "Here's to new beginnings." George clinked his glass against Francisco's, feeling the truth of those words resonate deeply. His life was finally his own, free from Janice's betrayal, free from her mother's manipulation, and free from the shame he had carried for so long. They spent the next hour catching up, laughing about old times, and talking about future plans. As the night wore on, and Francisco finally left, George stood at the door for a moment, watching his friend walk down the street. Closing the door quietly behind him, he felt a deep sense of contentment. Back in the living room, he poured himself another glass of wine and returned to his seat by the window. The night had fully settled in now, the sky a rich, dark velvet dotted with stars. George raised his glass again, this time not in celebration, but in quiet acknowledgement of all he had endured. "To new beginnings," he whispered softly, letting the calm of the night wash over him. He had won his battle over the lies, the betrayal, and the hurt. Now, the future was his to shape, and for the first time in years he truly looked forward to it.